100 years ago, women and men across the United States achieved a monumental win for the women's rights movement. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, extending suffrage to women. In honor of the United States Suffrage Centennial, we invite you to jump aboard the Suffrage Special Whistle Stop Tour. The Suffrage Special train will make 8 virtual whistle stops. We will visit Spokane, Pasco, Ellensburg, Vancouver, Bellingham, Seattle, Tacoma, and reach the end of the line in Olympia on August 26th. Join us as the Suffrage Special Whistle Stop Tour winds through Washington once again. Over 250 local and national suffrage leaders aboard the Suffrage Special arrived in their final stop, Seattle, at 11:30 p.m. on June 27th. Suffragists were met at King Street Station by a committee from the Washington Equal Suffrage Association and were taken by car to the Hotel Lincoln at 4th and Madison. A few days later, the Washington Equal Suffrage Association and National American Women's Suffrage Association hosted back-to-back conventions. The Seattle Times predicted the National Convention would be one of the most notable gatherings ever held in the interest of equal rights. Both conventions were held at Seattle's Plymouth Congregational Church. Pastor Reverend F.J. Van Horn was a supporter of the suffrage movement. Earlier that year, the Washington State Legislature agreed to put suffrage on the November 1910 ballot. If Washington State's male voters decided to ratify this amendment, Washington would break a 14-year lull in the suffrage movement and become the 5th state to allow women to vote. Meanwhile, Seattle was planning its first World's Fair. The goal of the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition, better known as the AYPE, was to show off the development of the Pacific Northwest. When the University of Washington campus was chosen as the location for the fair, it only had 3 buildings and was mostly forested. 4 years of planning and nearly $10 million later, 70 new buildings were erected for the exposition. Only 2 of these buildings remain standing today. The AYPE took place between June 1st and October 16, 1909. Exhibits, performances, gardens, and entertainment drew nearly 4 million visitors from across the nation. Many Washingtonians participated in the fair. Some groups were granted special days in the AYPE schedule. These days were intended to honor communities, places, nationalities, and special interests, and often offered special events such as luncheons, parades, or performances. Women's Suffrage Day was planned for July 7, 1909, the last day of the National Convention. Seeking to take advantage of Washington's momentum, the National American Women's Suffrage Association began making plans to promote suffrage to fairgoers. The AYPE suffrage publicity campaign had a rough start. During the state convention, a power struggle between President Emma Smith DeVoe and Vice President May Arkwright Hutton gained public attention. The turmoil came down to differences in their political styles. DeVoe and her supporters claimed that Hutton's aggressiveness was such that it nearly lost us our success in the state. Hutton's faction called DeVoe controlling and autocratic. The newspapers reported widely on the infighting between suffragists, much to the embarrassment of the convention organizers. The National American Women's Suffrage Association addressed the issue at the beginning of their convention and decided that both Emma and May's groups could attend, but none of the women who supported them would be allowed to vote. The media returned to reporting on the variety of suffrage programming held at local churches and clubs surrounding the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition. On Suffrage Day, local suffragists gave out pins and ribbons and balloons, a rare sight in 1909, emblazoned with the Votes for Women slogan. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer reported without regard to creed or sex, so long as the liberal supply of badges and buttons held out, every incomer at the gates was decorated with the label of the suffrage cause. Harriet Taylor Upton wrote in the suffragist journal, Progress, "It seemed strange as the speakers entered the gates to hear the megaphone man shouting, 'Suffrage Day! Woman's Day! Hear the Reverend Anna H. Shaw at the auditorium.' The exposition band was playing on the steps and people were crowding in. Over the entrance gates was a great sign, 'Votes for Women,' and flying high in the air between two kites was a huge streamer with the same words. When national officers, state presidents, and speakers were on the stage, the band, then inside, played 'In the Sweet By and By.'" On July 30th, Dr. Cora Eaton Smith, treasurer of the Washington Equal Suffrage Association and founding member of the Mountaineers, led a group of suffragists to the summit of Mount Rainier, where they planted both an AYPE flag and a Votes for Women pennant on Columbia Crest. The strong wind that day blew the pennants into a nearby crater, where they remain buried in the snow. The publicity and hard work at the AYPE paid off. The following year, the men voted nearly 2-1 for women's suffrage, a sweeping victory that made Washington the first in the 20th century to give voting rights to women. The achievement was celebrated by suffragists across the country for breaking a 14-year gridlock in the suffrage movement nationwide. It set the stage for multiple successes on the West Coast and across the nation. Few of the structures built for the AYPE remain today at the University of Washington. One survivor is the Women's Building, now Cunningham Hall, which was used as a discussion space for the topic of suffrage and also provided an exhibit space for arts and crafts by women artists. Local African American suffragist and activist Nettie Craig Asbury organized the Cloverleaf Art Club in anticipation of the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition. The formation of the Cloverleaf Art Club would eventually lead to the State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and the club's exhibit at the Women's Building of Needlework and Handicraft won a gold medal at the fair. Here is Nettie, who can tell you more about it.
I'm Dr. Nettie Craig Asbury. I am the first Negro woman to earn a doctorate. My degree is in music. In 1890, I came to Seattle and taught music in Seattle and Tacoma. I also involved myself in social and political matters concerning the rights of Negroes and women. When Seattle hosted the World's Fair, the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, I made sure that we Negroes had a presence there. We were less than 1% of the population, but still, I wanted those who came to the fair to know that we are here. Fair attendees got to see artistic creations made by our Cloverleaf Art Club. During the time of the fair, the woman's suffrage question was once again getting national attention. So the National American Woman Suffrage Association decided to hold their convention in Seattle to take advantage of the fair crowds. Those women came from the east by the trainload, made speeches, and spread pro-suffrage information throughout the city. We were working to convince the men to vote for the Washington bill that would be on the November 1910 ballot. If passed, that bill would grant full suffrage to Washington women. In 1870, Negro men got the right to vote and elected Negro men to Congress. So they understood and supported our desire to have the power of the vote. The local Washington Equal Suffrage Association members were also quite busy. One of the things they did was create a cookbook to calm the fears of those who believe that if women get the vote, they will no longer want to be homemakers. Negro women were not welcomed in the Washington Equal Suffrage Association, but welcomed or not, we made sure our voices were heard. We were not in the spotlight, but that did not keep us out of the action. Negro women's organizations worked as diligently as white women's organizations. So, Negro women, white women, and open-minded men, together we achieved our goal, making Washington the 5th state to grant full suffrage to women. With our win in Washington, we were another state closer to national suffrage. Our victory in 1910 inspired greater activity on the national level, and we achieved that goal in 1920. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. A lot of work had to happen to win that victory, including the 1913 march in Washington, D.C., organized by Alice Paul. Now, I was not in D.C. for that march, but my dear friend, Mrs. Ida B. Wells, a dynamic woman of action, attended. Listen.
Welcome to the untold stories of Black women in the women's suffrage movement. My name is Katie Hall, and I want you to join me as we explore women such as Susan B. Anthony and the role that she played in the suffrage movement, as well as women like Ida B. Wells and Anna Julia Cooper.
Ida B. Wells was an African-American investigative journalist, educator, and an early leader in the civil rights movement. She was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She arguably became the most famous Black woman in America during a life that was centered on combating prejudice and violence. She also fought for equality for African Americans, especially women. Wells was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and freed by the Emancipation Proclamation during the American Civil War. In 1870, African American men were granted the right to vote with the ratification of the 15th Amendment. However, poll taxes, literacy tests, fear, intimidation, and later Jim Crow laws were used in former slaveholding states to keep them from exercising their right to vote. At the age of 16, Ida lost both of her parents and her infant brother in 1878 due to the yellow fever epidemic. Wells moved with some of the siblings to Memphis, Tennessee, where she found better pay as a teacher. Soon she co-owned and wrote for the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper. In the 1890s, Wells documented lynching in the United States through her indictment called Southern Horrors Lynch Laws in all of its phases. Investigating frequent claims of whites that lynchings were reserved for Black criminals only, Wells exposed lynching as a barbaric practice of whites in the South used to intimidate and oppress African Americans who created economic and political competition. In a subsequent threat of loss of power for whites, a white mob destroyed her newspaper office and presses as her investigative reporting was carried nationally in Black-owned newspapers. After being forced to leave Memphis because of the 1892 expose she wrote about a lynching, Ida B. Wells starts the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, one of the first and most influential African-American suffrage groups in Illinois. The group immediately sets out to mobilize and register Black men and women voters. In 1880s, Black reformers began organizing their own groups. In 1896, they founded the National Association of Colored Women, which became the largest federation of local Black women's clubs. Their motto was "Lifting as we climb."
22 women that did something a long time ago that were college students at the time are founders of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, of which I am a member, a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Those 22 women were college students, young women at the time, who saw the importance of the right to vote. So their first act of public service when they became an organization was marching in the Women's Suffrage March. Yes, they had to march in the back, but they were there, they were present, they were college students. And that took extreme bravery and extreme forethought, and for them to be, in their teens and 20s and leading in that way and leading the way for hundreds of thousands of women that are a part of the sorority now puts them on the top of my list as my heroes.
Stanton and fellow abolitionist Susan B. Anthony are introduced and quickly began collaborating on the women's suffrage movement. Their life work included fighting for both to end slavery and property ownership of women. Susan B. Anthony has become a controversial figure in recent years, as she is quoted saying that women deserve the vote more than black men. Stanton, too, has been criticized for her views on extending voting rights to African Americans. She echoed Anthony's resentment that black men were allowed to vote before women. The first Women's Rights Convention is held in Seneca Falls, New York, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who began drawing up parallels between the condition of the enslaved population and their own condition as prisoners within a patriarchal society. Women from all over the United States and abroad traveled to Washington, D.C. to participate in the march. Paul, working with Mary Church Terrell, allowed African American women to participate, but they had to march in the back of the parade. Prominent leaders like Ida B. Wells didn't agree with this decision. While she started in the back with the rest of the black women, she ran to the front once the parade began to join the women in her state's delegation. Wells was outspoken regarding her beliefs as a black female activist and faced regular public disapproval, including that of leaders with diverging viewpoints from both the civil rights movement and the women's suffrage movement. Establishing several notable women's organizations, Wells was a skilled and persuasive speaker and traveled nationally and internationally on lecture tours. Anna Julia Cooper was born a slave August 10, 1858 in North Carolina. She graduated from Oberlin College in 1884. In 1902, she was named the principal at M Street High School, and she was an educator there through 1930. At the age of 67, she received her PhD in 1925.
So I think that we have come a long ways. If you look, you will see black women in all professions doing all kinds of things. They're working as CEOs, they're partners, they're surgeons. So we are doing a lot of things. We've come a long way. However, we still face many of the same issues that we faced, maybe not so much in 1920, but we still face issues that hold us back. We still have not broken all the way through the glass ceiling. We still are striving to do that.
Thank you for joining us as we explore the untold stories of black women during the women's suffrage movement. My hopes as the producer of this film is that you challenge yourself to dig back into the history of the women's suffrage movement, both the told stories and the untold stories. And collectively as women, we create the future that we want for our daughters and our granddaughters. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Katie Hall. What are the lessons we learned from the suffrage movement about the role black women play today to impact the future of women's rights and to ensure women have equal opportunity to lead, share their voice, and have representation?
Well, that's a great question, Katie. I think if you think back to the suffrage movement and the role that black women had, they had a really large role in the suffrage movement. People like Ida B. Wells, of course, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Maria Stewart, they all had a big part to play in the suffrage movement. And until there was like this divide over black men getting the vote over white women, and then there was kind of this divide. The thing that they did, though, they made it a priority to make sure that they continued to fight, not only based on the gender, but based on equality for our community and for black men. And so they continued to fight on in spite of this break in the alliance that they had with the white suffrage movement ladies. And for the suffrage movement, you mostly hear about, Susan B. Anthony and Miss Stanton. You mostly hear only about them. You don't hear about these other women. So what they did, and what is a lesson for the women today, is that they persevered. They were not silenced. They continued to fight. And as a matter of fact, they were responsible for getting the first black male into Congress. And he credits black women, Mr. DePriest credits black women with getting him elected to Congress. And out of that movement grew the National Association of Colored Women. And so they were able to accomplish all these things because they didn't let their voice be silenced. They persevered and they continued to fight. And we see that today in our black leaders, our black women leaders, that they're not being silenced, they're continuing to fight, they're persevering. We see more and more black women who are in office already. They're governors, they're in the Congress, they're mayors, they're judges, and more black women are running for these positions. And so I think that they have already taken a page from the book of the suffrage movement women that were powerful back in the 1920s and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we think about you today, you are a judge. How are you using your current platform to ensure that women and women of color are able to continue to have their voices heard, but then also that women are working together to unite? You mentioned about the divide with the white suffragists and the black suffragists.
Yes. So the way I use my platform, it's really a part of who I am. I'm a big believer in mentorship. I had many women mentor me, and that's both black women, women of color, and white women to mentor me. And so that is a tool that we as women really need to be using to help further the cause of other women and bringing other women up. As the National Association of Colored Women, their motto was lift as you climb, and that is truly what I try to do. So I mentor women, young girls, even grade school, and just try to inspire them that you can do whatever you want to do, and use myself as an example. I believe that we should be advisors to women who want to do things in politics or other areas, to show them the ropes, or if we don't know, lead them to someone who does know, and that's what I try to do, and to sponsor other women. When I had an opportunity to do a lot of hiring, I made sure that I hired women and women of color to these positions, because women really bring a different perspective and a different lens to the work that they do. I am also on the Supreme Court's Justice and Gender Commission, where we are doing work surrounding a variety of women's issues. We're taking on a study to study how far women have come in these last years in terms of wages, employment, all of these different areas. So it's very important that we come together, because women, we have so much power. And if we come together, we can accomplish so much. So we should be helping each other to move forward and to push the agenda. But those are the ways that I use my platform, mentorship and encouragement.
So what's the importance of the vote, and for women and girls in particular?
So it's really important. It's important that everyone votes, but for women, because we have very specific issues and things that affect us, and we need to make sure that we're voting in people that have our interest at heart. So that is the reason that it's really important for women to vote. But again, it's important for everyone to vote, and especially when you're talking about women and women of color, because sometimes we have different issues than maybe our white sisters have. And so we need to make sure that people that are in office are going to be in line with the issues that are important to us, and making sure that the laws and other things are in line with things that are important to us. So it is very important to vote. It is our voice. It is our voice when we vote. That is our voice. And so it's a way to use our voice. And it's very powerful.
Awesome. And just one more question for you. When you look out 100 years from now, so when we get to the 200-year anniversary, what do you want to see that's different than what you see today?
I want to know that my daughter and my daughter's daughter and on, that they were able to make a difference. They were able to do what they wanted to do. They were able to be in the forefront if that's what they wanted to do, and that they didn't have the struggles that all of us have had to get to where we are, and that they had people come alongside them and continue to help them grow. I'd like to see women not have to struggle to get where they need to go.
So can you share with us a little bit about the work that you do with women?
I am at the moment serving as the Washington State Poet Laureate. This is my third year in the position. It's a 2-year position, but I got an extension. And in that position, I am the first person of color in the state of Washington to be the Poet Laureate. And I'm also the first immigrant to hold that position. And I'm also the first person for whom English is not their first language. So I learned English once I arrived in the US, so it's my second tongue. So I'm a first of several. And and in that position in Washington State, we're very lucky that the Poet Laureate is a position of service, which means that we serve at the behest of the governor, but we get to travel the state. I mean, there's an expectation that you get to visit communities across the state, large and small, and share the power of literature with those communities, mostly, of course, through poetry. Teaching poetry classes in schools, in churches, in parks. I mean, I've done poetry hikes, in the mountains. I've done all sorts of interesting community engagement. And frankly, the reason why I took on the position, because I had just finished serving as Seattle's civic poet, was that I really wanted to offer to our kids of color in the state, to girls in particular, but also boys, that being a poet is something that people do. It is something that you could aspire to, and it's something that if I could be a poet, if this is what I love doing and I get to do it, I always tell the kids this, then surely you can, if that is what you want to do.
You spoke about being the first of many. What is the responsibility of being the first, especially when you think about like women and voting in particular?
Yeah, it's a huge responsibility. It's a big job. When you write something, it's becoming, it's being seen, it's articulating yourself in a way that fills you, you feel empowered. And I think voting, that extends very naturally to voting, because that's what voting is. Voting is exercising our right and our full citizenship, right? I mean, I think I take voting very seriously. And I think we have the joys of sharing in this land, and that is a responsibility we also have as citizens to exercise our voice in that way. And so I think that there's a translation between feeling seen and heard and voicing yourself through a piece of writing, and then participating in the civic process, of which voting is a big part.
Well, you just led right into my other question. Share with us a little bit about your story on how you made it to your journey of voting.
Well, I'm originally from El Salvador. I left El Salvador when I was 14 years old with my mom, my dad, and my sister. There was a civil war in El Salvador that forced a huge exodus that's still happening to this day. My family was very lucky. My mom had a sister who was a citizen, who had emigrated and was a citizen of the U.S. And through her, we were able to come. We were young, so my mom came and she was able to bring her family, so that all of us came as legal residents in Florida, of all places. So I lived in Florida for a little bit as a 10th grader. I was in the 10th grade. When you hold a green card, you wait 5 years, and at the end of those 5 years, you could legally apply to become a naturalized citizen. I waited 20 years to make that decision. And I was pregnant with my second child when that happened. And I really at that point felt, I'm not going back to El Salvador. This is where I live. I'm married. This is my second child. This will be my children's country.
And it behooves me to be an active part in terms of casting a vote, because I've already been very civically engaged, but in order to really cast a vote, I have taken every election very seriously, and I read the pamphlet, I weigh issues, and I think about what it is, how I'm casting my ballot, because I think it's the way in which we exercise our citizenship rights, and it's important to voice ourselves that way and to have the opportunity to do it too in a working democracy.
Can you share with us a little bit about some of the stories that you believe are untold when it comes to the women's suffrage movement?
I think that one of those stories, of course, is the way in which African American women were actively, in a way, excluded from participating in the movement, even though they had been working alongside white women for decades to make that happen. And that is a story that we need to know and be cognizant about. And also, the story of Native American women. The original members that created the suffragist movement took a lot of inspiration from Native American women and their way of life, and the way in which they held power in their communities, and the way in which they exercised their rights as their personhood, right? They had rights of personhood. Their body belonged to them, their children belonged to them, they had property rights, for instance, things that women outside of tribal lands did not have. So the 19th Amendment granted suffrage rights to women, but not all women were part of that, because Native American women were not, and men, did not yet have citizenship in this country. That did not happen until 1924, when citizenship was granted to Native Americans in the United States, but not voting rights. That was left out, and they had to, that was a political decision, they had to argue that at each state. So Native tribal leaders had to work with state leadership, individual states, one by one, and at different times they granted voting rights. And the last state to do so was Utah in 1962. So from 1924 to 1962, that is a lot of years where a lot of Native people could not exercise their right of citizenship through voting. Yeah, that is one of those untold stories. And it continues to happen. It's very difficult for a lot of Native Americans to vote. Polling places are very far away from their tribal locations. There's been lots of unaccounted or discarded ballots because when you register to vote, it asks you for an individual address. But inside reservations, people don't necessarily have grids like we do, and so listing an address is a cumbersome thing, because that is not the way they are organized. And so Washington State, for instance, last year passed a law that allows for tribal people living inside reservations to register to vote, giving an alternative address as a way of overcoming all these obstacles that have been experienced by Native peoples, for a long, long time. And these types of initiatives are happening in other states as well to ensure that Native Americans can exercise the right of suffrage. They signed the Declaration of Sentiments with nib of rib the right to suffrage, Theyre Daring. Called ugly then witch, pretty then weak, to be at once woman and voter, Theyre Daring. Hunger, headaches, heartaches, hatred, death, all this and more, it cost them, Theyre Daring. As men are born with God's grace, so are women, they urged and argued with brains and daring. With firm convictions and hopes of fallen yokes steadfast, they marched, nursing their dreams of future daring. Sojourner, Dolores, their daughters left behind now work against voter suppression with daring. There is more work on the horizon, more yeast to knead into the bread of their daring. Persist Claudia, in mind and body, be not ugly, not pretty, but ablaze with daring.
Next up is Tacoma. Don't miss meeting some incredible women changemakers who are building a new Tacoma for future generations. All aboard!